My name is Jess Hartley. I'm 31 years old, and last month at my own mother-in-law's retirement party, my brother-in-law stood up in front of 60 people and told everyone I had been stealing from the family business. He even pulled out printed documents that looked like proof. Within seconds, people I had known for years were looking at me like I was a stranger. My husband's face went pale. His mother covered her mouth, and the entire room went quiet. But I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just reached into my bag, pulled out my laptop, and said, "Can we pull up the company portal on a big screen? I think everyone should see this together." What happened next was something I still think about almost every day. Before I get into that night, I need to give you some background, because none of it makes sense without understanding who my brother-in-law is and how long this had actually been building. My husband's name is David. We have been married for 6 years. He is quiet, steady, the kind of person who thinks before he speaks, and almost never raises his voice. His mother, Patricia. Actually, I need to pause. I am not using her real name here. I will call her Carol. His mother, Carol, had spent 32 years building a small but successful event planning company from nothing. She started it out of her living room when David was 7 years old, grew it into something real, and last spring, she finally decided to step back and retire. The party was her celebration. Her friends were there. Her longtime clients were there. Her whole family was there. It was supposed to be a beautiful night for a woman who had worked incredibly hard her entire life. David's older brother, I'll call him Greg, had been working in the company for about 8 years. He handled the finances. He was good with numbers, confident in meetings, and everyone in the family treated him like the one who really kept things running. Even Carol leaned on him heavily, especially in the last few years as she was preparing to step away. Greg had always been polite to me, but underneath that politeness there was something cold. He never asked me questions. He never remembered things I had told him. At family dinners, he would talk over me or redirect conversations when I was mid-sentence. I used to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was being too sensitive, but David had noticed too. He just never wanted to make it into something bigger than it needed to be. About 4 months before the retirement party, I started helping Carol with some administrative work. Nothing major at first, just organizing vendor contracts, updating some spreadsheets, helping her prepare the transition documents she wanted to hand off before she officially retired. She asked me to do it because her assistant had left and I had a background in business operations. I was glad to help. Honestly, I loved spending that time with her. We would sit at her kitchen table on Saturday mornings with coffee and go through folders together, and she would tell me stories about the early days of the company. It was the closest I had ever felt to her. But as I got deeper into those documents, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Vendor payments that didn't match the contracts, a supplier invoice paid twice in the same month, amounts that seemed slightly off when I compared them across different files. I didn't say anything right away because I thought I might be misreading the records. I wasn't a forensic accountant. I was just someone who had worked in operations long enough to know when numbers didn't line up the way they should. I mentioned it quietly to David one night after Carol had gone to bed. He looked at the files with me for a while, and then he got very still. He said he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He asked me not to say anything to anyone yet. I agreed, but I kept a copy of everything I had looked at. I don't know exactly why I did it at the time. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe something in the back of my mind already knew where this was going. The retirement party was at a hotel ballroom. Carol had always loved a certain hotel in the city, the kind with high ceilings and warm gold lighting, and that was where her friends insisted on holding the event. When David and I arrived, the room was already filling up. I remember the centerpieces had white flowers and the tables were covered in a soft cream linen that Carol had picked out herself. She looked genuinely happy that night, the happiest I had seen her in years. She was wearing a navy dress and her hair was done, and she kept squeezing people's hands as they came in. Greg was already there when we arrived. He caught my eye from across the room and I smiled the way you do when you are trying to keep things smooth. He looked away without smiling back. That small thing sat in my stomach all evening. Dinner went well. People gave toasts. Carol cried a little. David held her hand and thanked her for everything she had built. I sat beside him and felt genuinely moved by the whole thing. Whatever had been worrying me in the background, I pushed it down that night because I wanted to be present for her. Then dessert was being served and Greg stood up. He didn't ask for anyone's attention in a cheerful way. He didn't clink his glass. He just stood up, buttoned his jacket, and waited until the room noticed him. It took about 10 seconds. Then he cleared his throat. He said he was sorry to bring something difficult into such a wonderful evening, but that he felt he had no choice. He said the company his mother had spent her life building had recently been compromised. He said there had been unauthorized access to financial records. He said money had been moved in ways that were irregular and unexplained. And then he looked directly at me. He said the access logs pointed to someone who had been given temporary access to company files in recent months. He said that person was me. He reached into a folder he had been holding and passed papers to the people at the tables nearest him. I could see from where I was sitting that they were printed spreadsheets, highlighted in places. He said the records clearly showed my login credentials accessing financial files outside of normal hours. He said transfers had been flagged. He said he had brought it to the party because Carol deserved to know the truth about the person her son had married before she handed over everything she had worked for. The room went completely silent. Someone near the back whispered something. A woman at the table beside me turned to look at me with an expression I cannot quite describe. David had gone rigid beside me. Carol had both hands pressed flat on the table in front of her. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the tablecloth. I could feel my heart pounding. My first instinct was to cry, because that is what happens when 60 people suddenly look at you like you might be a criminal. But underneath the shock, there was something else. There was a very specific, very cold kind of clarity. Because I knew what was actually on my laptop. I had not moved any money. I had not accessed anything I wasn't supposed to. But I had found records of someone who had. And I had been sitting on those records for 3 months because David had asked me to be careful. I took one slow breath. Then I reached under the table for my bag. David put his hand on my arm. He said my name quietly like a question. I told him I was okay. I told him to trust me. I stood up slowly. I didn't look panicked. I didn't look angry. I just looked at Greg calmly. Greg seemed surprised I was standing. He had probably expected tears. Maybe he had expected me to run. He held his ground and told everyone that I could explain myself in private, that this wasn't a place for a scene. I told him I agreed completely. This was not the place for a scene. That was why I was going to keep things simple and quick. I asked if there was someone who could help connect a laptop to the display screen on the wall at the front of the room. There was a long pause. A hotel staff member near the door looked around uncertainly. One of Carol's friends, a woman who had worked with her for years and helped organize the evening, walked to the front and said she could help. Greg's voice hardened. He said there was no need for that. He said the documents he had already shared were clear enough. I said I thought Carol deserved to see everything clearly, not just the documents Greg had printed. Everything. Carol finally looked up at me. Her expression was impossible to read. But she gave a small nod. The screen at the front of the room came to life. I walked up slowly, plugged in my laptop, and opened the first folder. Greg started to say something, but David was already on his feet, and whatever David said quietly to him made him stop. I pulled up the first set of files. These were the original vendor contracts, the ones Carol and I had gone through together at her kitchen table. I showed the room the contract amounts. Then I showed the corresponding invoices. Then I showed the payments on record. The numbers didn't match. Not because of anything I had done, because of adjustments that had been made after the contracts were filed. Small ones at first. A few hundred here, a few hundred there. But consistent. And consistent over 8 years. I could hear people in the room starting to murmur. I moved to the next file. This was where it got very quiet very fast. 3 months earlier, when I first noticed the discrepancies, I had done something on a quiet Sunday afternoon that I hadn't told anyone about. I had used a document tracking tool to log the edit history on the financial files I had been given access to. It was something I knew how to do from my operations background. The tool recorded every change made to a document, the date, the time, and the username associated with the account that made the change. I displayed that report on the screen. Every single adjustment. Every single adjustment. every modified invoice, every payment that had been quietly inflated or rerouted, all of it traced back to one login, one username, one account that had been active in the company's system for 8 years. Greg's. The room did not explode. It got very, very still. Someone near the front read the screen and said, slowly, out loud, that those were Greg's initials on every single line. Greg's chair scraped back. He stood up and said that was not possible. He said the records had been tampered with. He looked around the room, and for just a moment I saw something in his expression that I had never seen on him before, something that looked like fear. He turned to Carol and said she knew him. He said he had given everything to that company. He said I had clearly set him up. Carol was very quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "How much?" Greg didn't answer. David spoke instead. He had been looking at the report on the screen while Greg was talking. His voice was steady but low. He said the total across all the records I had pulled came to just over $94,000. Someone gasped. I heard it clearly from the front of the room. Carol closed her eyes. I want to stop here for a second because I have to be honest about what that moment felt like. Standing at the front of that room, watching Carol close her eyes, I did not feel triumphant. I felt sick. Because that was her son up there. That was her retirement party. And no matter what Greg had done, no matter how carefully I had prepared for that night, the grief on her face was real. And I had been the one to put it there, even if I hadn't started any of it. Greg tried once more. He said the documents could have been altered. He said I had access to the files too. He looked at his brother and said David needed to think about who he really trusted. David walked to my side. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just stood next to me and looked at his brother. Greg's wife had been sitting at the far end of the room and had not spoken once during any of this. She didn't speak now either. Greg finally sat back down. Whatever argument he had been building had nowhere left to go. One of Carol's longtime clients, a woman who had worked with her for almost 20 years and handled event venues across the city, stood up from her table. She said she was sorry to do this at such an occasion, but that she thought a formal review was necessary and that Carol should contact her attorney in the morning. Carol nodded slowly without opening her eyes. The evening did not recover from that moment. People filtered out quietly over the next hour. There were no more toasts. No one touched the rest of the desserts. The hotel staff began clearing things away with the careful efficiency of people trying not to make eye contact with anyone. David drove us home, and for a long time neither of us said anything. Somewhere on the highway with the city lights going past the windows, he said my name and then stopped. I waited. He said he was sorry he had asked me to stay quiet for so long. He said he should have trusted me to handle it. I told him that there was nothing to apologize for, because he had been trying to protect everyone at once, including his mother, including me, and that was not something I would ever hold against him. He was quiet for another few miles. Then he said he didn't know how he hadn't seen it. I told him that people who love someone do not spend their time looking for reasons that person might be stealing from them. That is not a character flaw. That is just what love looks like. He reached over and held my hand for the rest of the drive home. In the weeks after the party, Carol hired a forensic accounting firm to conduct a full review of the company's financial records going back 10 years. The findings confirmed everything that had appeared on the screen that night, and more. The total amount Greg had redirected over nearly a decade came to just over $110,000. Carol's attorney filed a civil suit. A criminal complaint was also filed. I don't know exactly where that process stands as of right now, because Carol has not shared every detail with us and we have not pushed her for them. What I do know is that she is not alone. David calls her every morning, and she comes to our house for dinner most Sundays. Greg has not reached out to David since that night. His wife sent a short message a few weeks later saying she was sorry for the way things had unfolded. That was all. There is one more thing I want to say before I finish, because I think about it more than I probably should. In the months before the party, when I was sitting at Carol's kitchen table going through those folders, I almost said nothing. Multiple times I almost closed the files and told myself it was not my place. He was her son. He was David's brother. I was the one who had only been in this family for 6 years, Who was I to walk into the middle of something that big and start asking questions? But I kept thinking about Carol, about 32 years of work, about the stories she told me over those Saturday morning coffees, about the way she lit up when she talked about the early days. And I thought that if I stayed quiet and she lost that, if she stepped away from everything she had built and handed it to someone who had been quietly hollowing it out for a decade, I would never forgive myself for knowing and saying nothing. I am not a hero in this story. I was just someone who paid attention, and I kept a copy of the files. Sometimes that is enough. I have thought a lot about what actually made that night turn out the way it did, and I don't think it was the laptop. I don't think it was the document tracking tool or the spreadsheets or even the forensic accounting report that came later. Those were just objects. What mattered was everything that happened before I ever walked into that hotel ballroom. Greg spent 8 years making small choices. Not one massive, dramatic decision, just small ones, over and over again. A few $100s adjusted here. An invoice quietly inflated there. Each individual choice probably felt manageable to him in the moment, maybe even justifiable. And because each one was small, and because the people who trusted him weren't looking, he kept going. That is how most things unravel, I think. Not in one catastrophic moment, but in a long, quiet accumulation of decisions that compound over time until the weight of them becomes impossible to hide. What I keep coming back to is that Greg was not unintelligent. He was good with numbers. He was confident. He knew how the company worked better than almost anyone, and he used all of that, every bit of it, to take from the person who had given him everything he had. That is not a failure of intelligence. That is a failure of character. And those two things are not the same, even though people sometimes confuse them. I was not smarter than Greg that night. I want to be honest about that. I just paid attention to something he assumed no one would ever look at closely. I noticed because I cared about Carol, and when you genuinely care about someone, you pay attention to the details of their life in a way that is almost involuntary. That attention saved her something real. There is a version of this story where I say nothing, where I close the files, tell myself it is not my place, and spend the rest of my life watching Carol wonder where the money went. I came close to that version several times. The hesitation was real. The fear of being wrong, of causing damage to a family that was not originally mine, of being seen as the outsider who stirred everything up. That was all very real. But I kept thinking about what it means to actually respect someone. Not to protect them from hard truths, but to trust them enough to tell the truth even when it costs you something. Carol had treated me with more genuine warmth than almost anyone in that family. Staying silent would have been the easier thing for me. It would have been the most convenient thing. But convenient and right are rarely the same thing. What I hope anyone watching this takes away is not that you should go looking for trouble in your own families. Most of the time, things are exactly what they appear to be, and suspicion without evidence is its own kind of poison. But if you ever find yourself holding information that matters, if you ever notice something real that someone you love needs to know, don't let the fear of being uncomfortable stop you from acting with integrity. The discomfort is temporary. The consequences of silence can last a very long time. Jess Hartley is just a name. But the situation is not unusual. People and families quietly take advantage of trust every single day, and often the people closest to them are the last to see it. Not because they are naive, but because love makes us want to believe the best. That instinct is not a weakness. But it does mean that sometimes the person who sees clearly is the one standing slightly outside the center of things, the one paying attention for different reasons. I kept a copy of the files because something felt wrong. That is all. And sometimes that is enough.